The crowd was cheering. That's what you remembered most later if you survived to have a later. The sound of hundreds of people laughing, eating, treating your torture as entertainment. You were chained to a wooden post in the town square, your back already shredded from 20 lashes of the whip. Blood soaked through what remained of your shirt and ran down your legs into the mud. But the whipping was just the beginning. The executioner approached with a red-hot branding iron, the metal glowing orange in the dim morning light. You were 16 years old. Your crime was stealing a loaf of bread from a baker's stall because you hadn't eaten in 3 days. You'd been caught within an hour. There was no trial, not really. Just a magistrate who looked at you for 30 seconds, heard the baker's accusation and sentenced you to public punishment. 50 lashes, branding, and your right hand severed at the wrist. The punishment was designed to be both painful and permanent, a warning to others, a mark you'd carry for whatever remained of your life. This was medieval justice, not the romantic tales of noble kings dispensing wisdom, not the fairy tale version where good was rewarded and evil punished fairly. Just brutal public torture designed to terrify the population into obedience, designed to demonstrate that authority was absolute and resistance was futile. You screamed when the brand touched your flesh. The smell of your own skin burning made you vomit, and the crowd cheered louder. Because in medieval Europe, justice wasn't about rehabilitation or fairness. It was about power, about pain, about making examples so horrific that people would rather starve than risk breaking the law. Medieval Europe from roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries had a justice system built on public torture and execution. Crime was punished with extreme violence, deliberately inflicted in public spaces where entire communities were expected to watch. The punishments were designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. Whipping, branding, mutilation, stocks and pillories where you'd be locked in place for hours or days while crowds threw rocks and garbage at you. Drawing and quartering where you'd be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. Burning alive, breaking on the wheel where your bones would be systematically shattered. These weren't rare punishments for the worst crimes. They were routine, common for theft, for speaking against authority, for religious offenses, for violations of countless laws most people didn't even know existed. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no appeals process. You were accused, tried quickly, often the same day, and sentenced immediately. And the sentences were carried out publicly, usually within hours. Justice was swift, brutal, and designed to terrorize. The system didn't care about guilt or innocence. It cared about maintaining order through fear, about demonstrating that authority could inflict unlimited pain on anyone who challenged it, and about providing entertainment for the masses. Because public executions and torture were spectacles, events that drew crowds, that people brought their children to watch, that were discussed and remembered, horror as policy, pain as deterrent, death as theater. Thomas Wilkins was 16 when he stole bread in Norwich in 1436. He wasn't a career criminal. He was a desperate orphan living on the streets after both his parents died from plague. He'd been surviving by begging and doing odd jobs, but work was scarce and food was scarcer. He hadn't eaten in 3 days when he saw bread cooling on a baker's windowsill. He grabbed a loaf and ran. The baker saw him, chased him, caught him within 2 streets. Thomas was dragged before the bailiff, the local authority responsible for justice. The bailiff listened to the baker's accusation, didn't ask Thomas why he'd stolen, didn't care about his circumstances, just asked if he'd done it. Thomas admitted it because denying obvious truth would make his punishment worse. The bailiff sentenced him on the spot, 50 lashes, branding on the forehead with the letter T for thief, an amputation of his right hand. The sentence would be carried out the next morning in the town square. Thomas spent the night in a cell that was more like a cage, freezing, terrified, his stomach still empty because even condemned prisoners weren't worth feeding. Morning came. Thomas was dragged to the square where a crowd had already gathered. Hundreds of people, Men, women, children, they'd come to watch. Some brought food. It was entertainment, a public spectacle to break up the monotony of medieval life. Thomas was stripped to the waist and chained to a whipping post. The executioner was a large man with a leather whip. He didn't speak, just began. The whip cracked across Thomas's back. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, like being cut with a hot knife. The whip struck again and again. Thomas screamed, couldn't help it. The pain was beyond anything he'd imagined. After 10 lashes, his back was shredded. Blood ran down in streams. After 20, he could barely stand. The chains held him up. After 30, he was sobbing, begging for it to stop. The crowd watched. Some cheered, some made jokes. Children stared with wide eyes. 50 lashes took maybe 10 minutes. When it was done, Thomas hung from the chains, barely conscious, his back a mass of torn flesh. But the punishment wasn't over. The executioner heated an iron brand in a brazier until it glowed. Then he grabbed Thomas's head, held it still, and pressed the brand against his forehead. The pain was indescribable, worse than the whipping, the smell of burning flesh, the sizzling sound. Thomas's scream was raw, primal. When the brand was removed, a large T was burned into his forehead, a permanent mark that would identify him as a thief for the rest of his life. He'd never be able to hide what he'd done. Every person who saw him would know, would treat him as a criminal, would refuse him work, shelter, help. The brand condemned him to a life of suspicion and rejection, but still the punishment wasn't finished. The executioner took Thomas's right hand and placed it on a wooden block, drew a heavy blade, and with one swing severed the hand at the wrist. Thomas's scream cut off as he passed out from shock and pain. Blood sprayed from the stump. The executioner cauterized the wound with a hot iron, burning the flesh to seal it. Thomas woke from the pain of the cauterization, screaming again. Then he was cut down and left in the mud of the square, bleeding, burned, mutilated, while the crowd dispersed to go about their day. Were Thomas, 16 years old and having your hand cut off for stealing bread when you were starving, being branded and marked forever, knowing this was legal and accepted and that no one would help you, what would you have thought about justice, about society, about humanity itself? The punishments served multiple purposes. They were meant to deter crime through terror, to demonstrate authorities' power, and to provide entertainment. Public executions were major events. Entire towns would shut down. People would come from miles away. They'd make a day of it, bring food, set up vendors selling refreshments. Children would be lifted onto shoulders for better views, and the condemned would be tortured to death while people cheered. Hanging was common, but not the quick drop that breaks the neck. Medieval hanging meant slow strangulation. You'd be hoisted up and left to kick and choke for minutes, sometimes longer, until you died from lack of air. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics and witches. You'd be tied to a post with wood piled around you. The fire would be lit. If you were lucky, the smoke killed you before the flames. If not, you'd burn alive, screaming while hundreds watched. Drawing and quartering was for the worst offenses like treason. You'd be dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, cut down, then disemboweled while conscious. Your intestines pulled out and burned in front of you. Then your body would be cut into 4 pieces. The pieces would be displayed in different parts of town as a warning. This wasn't punishment. This was torture, state-sanctioned torture as public policy. But here's what makes medieval justice even more horrifying. The system was arbitrary and biased. If you had money or connections, you could often pay your way out of punishment, fines instead of torture. Justice for the wealthy looked very different than justice for the poor. Thomas stole bread. A wealthy person who stole would pay compensation and maybe a fine. Thomas got 50 lashes, branding, and mutilation. The system wasn't about justice. It was about control, about keeping the poor terrified and compliant, about demonstrating that their lives were worthless and could be destroyed at any time for any reason. And the wealthy supported this system because it protected their property and their position. They attended the executions. They approved the sentences. They benefited from a population too afraid to challenge authority. Medieval justice was class warfare disguised as law and order. It was systematic oppression enforced through public torture. And it worked. People lived in constant fear. Even minor offenses could result in mutilation or death. So people stayed in line, accepted their poverty, accepted their suffering, because the alternative was having your hand cut off in the town square while your neighbors watched and cheered. Think about living in a society where stealing food when you're starving results in permanent mutilation, where speaking against authority results in having your tongue cut out, where being accused of witchcraft results in being burned alive, where there's no fair trial, no appeal, no mercy. Could you have lived in that world? Would you have been able to watch public torture and executions and not lose faith in humanity? Most people who were punished severely in medieval justice didn't survive long afterward. The trauma, infection, and inability to work or support themselves killed them within months or years. Thomas survived the immediate punishment but was left with horrific injuries. His back was scarred, infected, painful. His forehead was permanently marked. His right hand was gone. He was right-handed. Most tasks required two hands. He couldn't work, couldn't beg effectively because the brand marked him as a thief and people wouldn't give him money. He couldn't hide what he was. Every person who saw him knew he'd been punished, knew he was criminal, treated him with contempt or fear. Thomas tried to survive. He really did. He begged. He ate garbage. He slept in alleys and doorways, but without a hand, his options were impossibly limited. He couldn't do labor, couldn't hold tools, couldn't defend himself when other street people attacked him. Winter came. Thomas had no shelter, no food, no way to keep warm with only one hand. He developed an infection in the stump where his hand had been. The cauterization had sealed the wound but not cleanly. Bacteria had gotten in. The infection spread up his arm. His arm swelled, turned red. Then black gangrene set in. Thomas was dying, slowly, painfully, from an infected wound he'd received as punishment for being hungry. Thomas died in an alley in early February, 6 months after his punishment. He was 16 years old. He'd lived his entire short life in poverty, survived the plague that killed his parents, tried desperately to survive on the streets, and been destroyed by a justice system that saw his life as worthless. His body was found days later, frozen, rotted. No one knew his name. No one cared. He was just another dead beggar, another casualty of a system designed to kill people like him. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the paupers section of the churchyard. No ceremony, no marker, no recognition that he'd ever existed. The baker whose bread he'd stolen never thought about him again. The bailiff who'd sentenced him never wondered what happened to the boy. The executioner who'd mutilated him moved on to the next punishment. Thomas was forgotten immediately. Just another example made. Another body used to send a message to the poor: stay in your place or suffer. Medieval justice destroyed thousands of people like Thomas every year. People accused of petty crimes. People who'd violated laws they didn't know existed. People who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The system consumed them, used their bodies as warnings, then discarded them. And society accepted this as normal, as necessary, as the way things had to be. Churches preached about sin and punishment. Nobles watched executions from comfortable positions. Common people brought their children to learn what happened to criminals. The brutality was so normalized that people couldn't imagine any other way. This was justice. This was order. This was civilization. And anyone who questioned it was likely to end up on the execution block themselves. The system protected itself through fear, through demonstrating over and over that resistance meant death, that questioning authority meant torture, that mercy was weakness and brutality was strength. Medieval justice wasn't a failure. It was working exactly as designed: to terrorize, to control, to maintain a social hierarchy where the poor knew their place and the wealthy knew they were safe. Thomas died to maintain that system. His suffering served that purpose, and no one mourned him. Even as medieval society eventually gave way to early modern systems, the brutality of justice continued for centuries. Public executions continued into the 19th century in some places. Torture continued as an accepted practice. The fundamental belief that criminals were less than human and deserved to suffer persisted. Reforms came slowly. The idea that punishment should be proportional to the crime, that torture was wrong. That execution should be reserved for the most serious offenses. These were radical ideas that took generations to implement. And even today, echoes of medieval justice persist, in systems that brutalize prisoners, in societies that see punishment as more important than rehabilitation, in attitudes that some people deserve to suffer for their crimes. Thomas's death in 1436 wasn't an aberration. It was policy, accepted, normal, celebrated, and the mindset that made it possible never fully disappeared. It just evolved, found new forms, new justifications. The specific practices changed, but the willingness to inflict suffering on the powerless remained. Thomas deserved better, deserved a system that asked why he'd stolen before deciding his punishment, deserved recognition that starvation might justify taking bread, deserved mercy, rehabilitation, a second chance. He got none of that, got only brutality, got only pain, got only a death that no one noticed or cared about. That's medieval justice. That's what it really meant. Not fairy tale kings dispensing wisdom, not noble knights protecting the innocent, just systematic brutality, just torture as policy, just broken bodies in town squares serving as warnings to everyone else that their lives didn't matter and their suffering was acceptable as long as it maintained order. Thomas learned that lesson, and died from it, and was forgotten, just like the system wanted. That's the truth. The brutal, ugly truth that fairy tales hide, and it's a truth we need to remember. Because forgetting means we risk repeating, means we risk accepting brutality when it's dressed up as necessary, means we risk becoming the crowds that cheered while Thomas screamed, and that's unacceptable. Thomas deserved better. We all do. And remembering what was done to him is the first step toward ensuring it never happens again.